So our next speaker is John Lawhead, and he's going to give a talk on MultiScale Modeling, changing the scale as I try to read it.
Yeah, sorry about that.
And climate model pluralism.
Yeah. All right, so this is going to have to necessarily be really quickly. I tend to pace a lot when I'm talking. I'm going to try not to do that so you don't have to follow me around, but I might start doing it accidentally. I was a graduate student at Columbia, and my background is in philosophy. I now am a postdoc at the University of Southern California in an earth science department, doing sort of interdisciplinary stuff with sustainability, geoengineering, philosophy of complexity theory. So I'm kind of all over the place. Whenever I'm with any group of experts, usually I'm the person who doesn't know what they're talking about, so everybody kind of thinks that I'm completely incoherent all of the time, which is why I like this kind of interdisciplinary meeting, because there's at least a little bit of appreciation for that kind of stuff. So this is a 10 or 15 minute condensed version of a paper, a number of different things that I'm interested in. It was going to be a poster originally. Now it might as well just be some of my favorite things. So it's kind of just food for thought. It's going to be some stuff just to get you thinking about some of this stuff. Here's a problem, and this is a problem that pops up a lot in a number of different fields, which is a good indication that you've got an interesting sort of foundational issue, which is what makes a good model and how do we integrate models that are operating at different scales, but are supposed to be latching on in some sense to the same system. How do we integrate all that together so that we understand what's going on in the system as a cohesive whole? People have said a bunch of times in this meeting, no model is true, some models are useful or something like that, which is a really common refrain in a lot of different sciences. There's another really common adage that I don't think has popped up yet, which is that the world is its own best model. What's the sense of best, though, in that sort of question, is something that I don't think has been addressed. It's popped up a little bit in this meeting, but that's what I'm going to try to talk about a little bit here. So this is a quote that I love by Simon Lebon, who was, maybe is still, I'm not sure if he's still alive, an ecologist. This is from his MacArthur lecture from the late 1980s, 1989, I think. A good model does not seek to reproduce every detail of the system being modeled. The system itself suffices as a detailed model of itself. Rather, the objective of a model should be to ask how much detail can be ignored without producing results that contradict a specific set of observations on particular scales of interest. The relevant part of this for our purposes here is going to be the scales of interest stuff. How do we define what an interesting scale is with regard particularly to climate systems? What counts as a scale? How does that end up carving stuff up? Lebon says that there's no correct scale for modeling a system. This paper is really fantastic. I just discovered it right before I came to this meeting. If you haven't looked at this, I can give you the reference at the end. It's very interesting to read. And he's doing a lot of good foundational work, which you don't see a lot from the scientific community. So he says there's no correct scale for modeling a given system. This is surely right, but some systems suggest a sort of more natural scale than others do. So for instance, if I'm CERN and I'm working with the Large Hadron Collider, there's a sort of sense that there's a very reasonable spatio-temporal scale for me to pick when I'm doing my model building. I'm interested in very small stuff or equivalently really high energy things. That's not always the case though. So CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, might suggest a really natural scale, even if it's not the correct scale in the philosopher's robust sense. But other systems are more complicated. So this is from Oppenheim and Putnam. I don't know how many people here are philosophers in background, but this is a really famous paper called The Unity of Science as a Working Hypothesis from 1958. They were interested in trying to tie all of the sciences, the special sciences, together into a unified package. They ended up coming up with, sorry, I'm going to have to run over here really quick, this model that sort of looks like a pyramid with all of the sciences sort of neatly demarcated into these levels. They thought about elementary particles as being the really basic level. Then you have atoms, and then you put atoms together and you get slightly bigger stuff. Molecules make up cells. Cells make up living things. Living things make up social systems. Their claim was that every system neatly is going to decompose into just parts that look like this. Every object that you should be able to pick out is going to occupy one and only one of these levels. There's no interlevel composites. Looking back on this now, it's sort of shocking that anybody ever took an idea like this seriously, let alone people who were as smart as these guys were. This is clearly wrong. And from the perspective of contemporary philosophy of science, let alone contemporary science, we know that this is just not the case. This is not how science works. There are lots of times that we're interested in things, systems that are going to cut across these levels, or they're going to have parts that don't look anything like this. Science isn't organized into this kind of pyramid-like hierarchy. So this is the wrong way to think about science, but it's something that held dominance for a really long time. This is sort of where philosophers got the idea of carving nature at its joints also. That's played a big role in the natural kinds sort of debate. So here's Lebon again from the same paper. Not all systems allow subdivision into neat hierarchical scales of organization. In the case of a host-parasite system, he was an ecologist, the units are fairly discrete and distinct. In the case of terrestrial vegetation, the gradations are more like those already discussed for Antarctic krill. He was looking at krill patches in the southern oceans. Patches do not have a narrow range of sizes, but are found across a broad spectrum. So you might have little tiny rafts of krill, and then great big mega rafts also. That is, patchiness is found at almost every scale of observation. In this case, there is no unique natural scale, even though some scales may provide more natural biological vantage points. One must recognize that the description of the system will vary with the choice of scales. Each species, including the human species, will sample and experience the environment on a unique range of scales, and that rather than trying to determine the correct scale, we must understand simply how the system description changes across scales. So that's added emphasis. I've suggested elsewhere in things that I've published that this last part, understanding how the system description changes across scales, is a really natural and formalizable way to think about how to measure the complexity of a system. So when you think about or talk about whether or not a given thing that we're studying is a complex system or not, which is a term that gets thrown around a lot, this is a natural way, I think, to formalize that. I'm not going to go into that right now, but it's an interesting sort of side point. So why is this relevant to climate models? 5 minutes or something like that.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, another, 5.
Okay. Why is this relevant to climate models? Climate science, as we've seen, I think, with a lot of what people have been saying here, and Gavin's talk this morning in particular, I think highlighted this. There's interesting stuff that's happening at a lot of different scales of analysis. So he put up that log graph where you had everything down from the flow of air molecules, right, that are little teeny tiny things, up to the scale of the whole planet in thousands or hundreds of thousands of kilometers. And there's interesting dynamics at every scale. So any kind of scale relative discussion, scale relative modeling is going to be immediately applicable to climate science. I think this point is true in 2 senses. One of them is sort of obvious, and one of them is a little less obvious. The obvious sense is that we can speak meaningfully about short period cycles like ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, as well as long period cycles like the Milankovitch cycles with the hundreds of million year thing that involves axial tilt and is part of what controls glaciation, as well as spatially large phenomena like the jet stream versus spatially small phenomena like clouds. From the perspective of climatology, clouds are quite small. You can go even smaller and talk about the fluid dynamics stuff in the atmosphere. So that's the obvious sense. The less obvious sense is that depending on the precision with which we want to model the future of the climate, we might need to include a lot of parameters that at first glance look non-climatological. And this is where I think the Oppenheim and Putnam stuff, the pyramid, is relevant. We're going to have modeling inputs parameterizations that are going to cut across levels. So think about the quest to model the long-term behavior over the next, say, 100 years of carbon in the atmosphere or the global temperature. It's becoming increasingly clear that it's going to be impossible to do that in any kind of robust or meaningful way without including some kind of parameterization about human activity. So how the climate forcings act back on economic systems, how we behave, how we structure our laws, how we structure our regulations, carbon tax kind of stuff, is going to have to be included in any kind of climate modeling stuff. Where does that fit? Where do economic systems fit in this sort of spatio-temporal log scale that Gavin put up this morning? It's not clear that they have a neat place. What are the constituents of an economic system, right? Are they big things? Are they small things? Are they things that take a long time? Are they things that take a short time? It seems pretty clear to me that the answer is that it's all of them, sort of mixed up, right? Economic actors might be firms that have decision-making timelines in decades. They might be individual consumers that have decision-making timeline in years or months. And all of this is sort of mixed up in a way that's really difficult to integrate into this sort of hierarchical way of thinking about scales. But a good climatology model, a good climate science model that's predicting the future in a robust way is going to have to figure out some way to bring in stuff that's really going on in what looks like a completely separate science. Both of these senses of the question suggest another question that I'd like to focus on for the really limited amount of discussion time and question time that we have, which is something I'll come back to at the end, but just as a sort of preview, should we try to be eliminating this sort of model pluralism that people have been talking about in almost every talk that has involved model building? Again, Gavin's was a perfect example this morning. You have everything from these high-level computational models all the way down to the energy balance models and everything in between, specialized tools for modeling regional states. Should we think that this is just a temporary setback, something that's going to go away as the models converge and the science matures, or should we get comfortable with this pluralism? I've heard it from both sides. So I'm interested sort of to see what people have to say here. Some climatologists that I talk to think that this plurality, the fact that we have lots of different climate models that operate on different and sometimes incompatible assumptions and that are doing really, really different tasks, is something that we just have to get used to. And that even as the science matures, we're not going to end up eventually with some sort of big, high-level computational model that's going to be the one model to rule them all, and the kind of thing that's making all of our predictions for us about everything relevant. Some people think that this is just a temporary state of uncertainty, and eventually we're going to get to that place. Well, I guess that is. So very, very briefly, just a little bit of philosophy of complexity theory. There are ways to mathematize this that if I had more than like 15 minutes to talk about this and do a whirlwind tour through it, I would mention, if you're interested, the people that I think are doing the best work on this is the New England Complex Systems Institute. A guy named Yanir Baryam, in particular, has worked out a really neat way using the mathematics of information theory to talk about multi-scale interactions and how assumptions and uncertainties that are operating at one scale are feeding into the uncertainties and assumptions at another scale and come out with a unified measure of this stuff. But we don't have time really to go into all of that. So again, this seems sort of disjointed and kind of all over the place, but I hope at least this suggests some interesting stuff. There's good philosophical work, I think, to be done here in thinking about how this stuff works, how high-level patterns emerge from the interactions at smaller scales, what a scale means, and what this means for the structure of science, sociologically, and the structure of our inquiry into it. So again, this is the question that I hope people will give me an impression about, especially if you operate mostly in the realm of climate science here. That's pretty much all I've got without going into more detail. So thank you, John.
Yeah, we do have 5 minutes for questions.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk. I think I want to ask, I want to make a comment that draws you, gives you a little more time to talk about this one model to rule them all.
Yeah.
I think there's sort of an issue about where we are now and where we might be one day.
Right.
And my previous position, which you may be able to change, is that right now we have models which are different in order one statistics.
Yeah.
Right? The global mean temperature is an order of magnitude, the diversity is an order of magnitude the uncertainty of its measurement.
Right.
But as the models get better, eventually we would expect them to start to agree in distribution. Right? They won't agree in detail, but the distributions of their forward, as you run them forward in time, will start to converge. And once they do, I don't know if you want to say one will rule them all, but it doesn't really matter which one you look at.
Right.
And keeping them all running would just be extra, in a sense. Unless they differ in some interesting way, which can tell you what to work on next. But right now, so my question really is, when we're in the situation where none of them can even rule themselves, we basically have a divergence between almost all the distributions that we're interested in unless we subtract off the mean, then how do we use them now? How do we look towards moving forward? I mean, if we think about it physically, then we basically work out we need computer power that we're not going to have for another 30 or 40 years.
At least,
Is there another way of, is there a way of thinking about how to move forward? We're in a situation where the models really disagree in distribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have covered this really well, actually, and doing the kind of ensemble statistics that people have talked about seems like the best sort of kludge that we've got right now. I think the best way to think about climate models is rather than the things that are supposed to be giving us exact predictions, I'd rather think about them as a kind of tool for making decisions. It's a practical tool for deciding. Dan Dennett, philosopher of science and mind, talks about computers as tools for thinking. I think climate models are a kind of tool for making decisions. And so this kind of ensemble statistics, which sometimes is mathematically grounded, well-formed, sometimes it makes absolutely no sense, but just happens to work, right? So people will take averages and just straight averages of the output. Sometimes they turn out to be more accurate than any of the model runs by themselves, but that's really poorly grounded in any kind of foundations of mathematics. It seems okay right now. I mean, it's where we're at, and if it's helping us make meaningful decisions about how to structure carbon taxes in the short term or medium term, that's good, and that's kind of all I think we can expect out of them. As we get toward the future, I think you're talking about convergence, but if we end up at a point where all of our different models are giving exactly the same output for any given set of input minus the random seed or whatever, I don't see any sense in which they're relevantly different models anymore. And it looks like maybe they're just going to be different kind of ways of phrasing exactly the same underlying mathematical structure. I think that everybody has had to bring this into their talk. The yikes moment that we had yesterday is an interesting sort of input to this discussion that maybe these specialized tools are going to be ineliminable in some sense, because every time we want to investigate some sort of small scale phenomena, we might need to bring in some sort of specialized thing that's designed exactly to deal with that, even if we have very, very good convergent high-level models for the global stuff. I don't know if that answers what your concern was at all.
It was a good push.
It's something.
Maybe a quick question here. We have a
Yes. Thanks for the interesting talk. And I want to tease apart a little bit, prediction for testing scientific hypothesis and prediction for decision making.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you want to use models to predict, to test scientific hypotheses. And so that clearly seems to be something we want to do with climate models. Then though you described this sort of, integrated Earth systems model where we get, the economics and all, so we can do these long-term forecasts, which is presumably not necessary for scientific testing of models, because you wouldn't need to do that.
Depends on the model. Maybe.
Well, because you wouldn't observe any data where you didn't know the emissions.
Right.
Right. So,
Right.
yeah, so you don't need,
Right.
so you don't need to do that
Yeah.
for scientific testing. So then, I mean, so then you're basically making the claim that we need, you know, long-term coupled Earth systems model in order to set a carbon tax. And I'm not.
Or however we're going to respond to that.
Yeah,
I don't know.
So,
I mean,
yeah. Well,
that's not
I'm
my
using
area,
something
so I'm
very
saying
specific
agnostic on that.
because I think you should think carefully about whether that's in fact the case.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So.
Carefully about whether what exactly that the models are going to.
Well, that's a polite way of saying I don't
think
think that making an integrated Earth system model that has all the economics and technology forecasts for 100 years built into it in an accurate way
Yeah.
is a necessary, sufficient, or possible condition.
It's
for
not
reasonable
possible.
outcome. Yeah.
I agree entirely, and
Yeah.
that was maybe the speed of this mangled my point a little bit, but that's exactly the point that I was trying to make, and I agree entirely with that.
Okay.
I think the claim that people, or the ideal that people have, that we're going to get to a point where we have a single integrated climate model that's going to make all of our interesting predictions for us is absolutely crazy for exactly that reason.
And then
there's
it's
just
no longer
too
the climate
much.
model anymore, and it's not clear even the climate stuff is
Right.
integral for the key
Good.
pieces you want to get there.
Good.
Anyway, so
I agree entirely. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we should stop as we agree.
All right. Good. We'll start with you.